Hey everyone, Liam here. Welcome to this week's Patreon video. This is going to be the last video for the Eldar avatar. We're going to be painting the purple power blade and we're going to be doing the quick and easy blood effects on the actual hand. So as always, I hope it's helpful. Thank you everyone for the support. It means a huge amount. And here we go. So to start this off, keep the recipe really simple. This is a tabletop piece. I'm using Vallejo model color violet, Vallejo model color white, Vallejo model color black, and I'm using a bit of scale 75 Inktense purple. This gives us a really nice intensity to it. The axe is base coated black, so it's primed black, which is always my preference. And then what I've done is a equal mix of Vallejo model color violet and scale 75 Inktense purple. That's what gives you this really dark base coat. Once I've got that, then I start using Vallejo model color violet and I place in solid chunks of the Vallejo model color violet, which is what you can see on there at the moment. Now, because this is a tabletop piece, I'm not going too crazy on the reflections. So what I have on both of these blade sections, on both of the flats of the blades, I've got two highlight points. And I put them in the middle of the blade so they're not towards the peak, so you can see them there. And then all I'm going to start doing is very quickly glazing them together. So remember, check out the glazing video if you want more information on that. Now, the big thing that I am doing here is because this is a tabletop piece, I don't want to spend huge amounts of time. The transitions don't need to be amazing. So what I'm doing is I'm working the whole of this blade all in one go. So as soon as I glaze over this area, for example, this little highlight area, if that paint is not dried, then what I'll do is I'll go and glaze into another one of those little reflections on a different part of the blade. So while I'm waiting for paint to dry, I can be working another area. So this is all about being efficient in this case. Now, you can see the transitions are far from perfect at the moment, but have some kind of soft transition. Next step for me, because I want to see what this is going to look like, add a little bit of white to the Vallejo model color violet and I start painting in my edge highlights. Now, ultimately this blade uses the rules for non-metal metallic, and we know that as soon as we want some kind of almost shiny result, what we want to do is make sure that our edge highlights are in place because it frames the blade and it helps with the illusion. So I've placed in my edge highlights. I've also brightened up, as you can see, the reflection points. Now, what I'm actually doing here is I'm trying to prioritize a big, solid, flat color. So I don't want texture or anything like that. If I get a little bit of material texture or something like that, I'm not too fussed. But the idea with this is because I want to work quickly in these highlight areas effectively, I want to have a nice, solid, bright color, because then when I glaze over it later, I have what it's going to do is it's going to darken down the outer areas of that anyway. So it just saves me some time. So big solid chunks of highlight. And then like you can see here, I've just done a really messy wet glaze over the whole thing. And it just starts to soften out those marks. And then we'll be a little bit more precise further down the line. But you can do this with stippling as well if you choose. For me in this case, because it's quite a large area, there's not really a huge amount of benefit of doing that, and because I don't particularly care about amazing transitions, perfect transitions. Because the thing is, by the time we do the transitions on this, and then by the time we put in the last edge highlights and the little shine spots, no one's really going to notice. And I mean, when we're looking at this from a distance across the table, no one's really going to notice. Like, you're not going to see these imperfections in the blend. So remember, not everything always needs to be perfect to get a nice result. This is really important. I think people chase that really smooth transition far too much. It's not always required, especially if you actually want to have models finished at the end of it. Now you can see I'm starting to soften out where that highlight transitions into the darker area. This is where I start stippling, because for me that's my preferred method. But ultimately, I'm still using a glaze consistency of paint. So you could do the more traditional glaze brushstroke with the side of your brush if you want. It's just me falling into my habits and I start stippling and doing variations of, because that's what I enjoy. Next step is we've got this really, well, not terrible, but we've got this rough transition for the going from dark to light. So I'm going to start stippling in a brighter highlight towards the center of this again. Again, this is glaze consistency of paint. We're using a super, super thin paint, so it's really, really transparent. When we were painting on big flat layers of color for the highlight, we were using a base coat consistency. So we were looking for a paint, what that is, as transparent as, as opaque as possible, while still being as fluid as possible. Because the thing is, we need it fluid so it doesn't leave big blobs of paint, but we need it as opaque as possible so we don't have to do multiple layers. So again, check out the base coating video for that. But these last little transitions, I'm stippling that in basically with a glaze consistency of paint, so super, super thin. You can do like a side stroke motion if you want. You can do whatever you want, whatever your preferred method is. Next, once again, I'm going to place in these edge highlights. The edge highlights frame the blade. It also gives us a really good idea of what this is going to look like on how nice the result is going to be. And you can see it's starting to come together. For me, I feel like it's missing the shine spots. We've got these nice highlights. We've got these nice edge highlights in place. We've got the reflections, but there's not really any like shiny bright spot on it. So I want to push that a little bit further. So once again, all I'm doing is adding white to the purple. The reason why I'm adding white is because it goes towards this very desaturated purple. If you start adding like reds and that sort of stuff, or blues, it goes more towards like a pink or a blue. That's not particularly what I wanted. Again, my preference is I'm stippling. If you want to, you can do like a side stroke motion. You do you, right? There's no right or wrong here. This blade is about efficiency. So do go along with the process that you're comfortable with. Now, the only thing that's really important to note is everything is really small here. You can see that shine spot is absolutely tiny. Like less is more. The smaller we make our shine spot, the more it's going to pop, the more it's going to stand out. If you make it huge, then it's not really going to shine. All that's going to happen is it's going to look like a big whitey purple blade, and it doesn't work. So just bear that in mind. Less is absolutely more with this stuff. So I'm going to keep this smoothing out now. Again, it's just a case of working back and forward. This isn't a linear process. We've gone really bright. If the transition starts to look a little bit funky, go a little bit darker with the purple again and blend it back in. You can see I've got this shine spot in the middle of the blade. I've got another shine spot towards the tip of the blade, which is where I'm painting now. That's enough. Like, we don't need to go crazy with it. You can, which is what I'm about to do here, push the edge highlights brighter as well. I personally like my edge highlights, especially the edge highlights that are facing the light, to be much brighter, or as bright as the brightest shine spot on the actual blade itself. It's just an aesthetic choice. It's probably not a good rule to follow, because if you always follow that rule, then potentially what's going to happen is you get into this pattern and you always expect to do that, and ultimately you want variation in your painting. So don't stick to that as a rule. It's just something that I like to do for army pieces. Now, with the filigree or whatever, I apologize, my head's in the way here, but this is, I'm painting pure white into the little recess patterns here. Now, to make my life easier, I'm using pure white ink. This is scale 75 white ink, and all I'm doing is dropping it into that recess. You can see that I'm not even being that careful. Now, the thing is, because it's ink, it's really, really potent, so it's going to leave solid white in that recess, which is exactly what I want. And because it's ink as well, it's almost like a wash, so it flows really well. So we haven't even got a huge amount, like, we haven't got to worry about being really precise or anything like that. All I'm doing is I'm not worrying about the area around it. I'm just dropping that ink in. I'm treating it, for all intents and purposes, just like a wash. I'll let that dry, and then we'll clean it up later, adding in the edge highlights for the rest of the blade. And you can see, like, this blade is already starting to look nice, and I haven't even painted the back part of it or the bottom part of the blade, and it's still very, very messy. So it just goes to show that you don't need to spend a huge amount of time. I think this axe took me about half an hour in total. Now, I appreciate I've done this quite a lot in the past, so you may not quite be that quick, but at the end of the day, my point here is not everything needs to be a masterpiece. So I'm doing exactly the same thing with the bottom part of the blade. And again, I'm not following any like secret rules or anything like that for highlight placement. All I've got is dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. I'm alternating between those. I haven't got, all of them are basically the same brightness. All of the shadows are basically the same darkness. I'm not getting really far advanced into it. It's literally just a pattern of light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. Keep it really, really simple. You can also see where I've dropped that ink into the lettering or the runes or whatever they've called. You can see how the white has gone over the whole of the flat side of the blade around those runes. We'll fix that later once the ink is dry. There's a really, really simple method of doing it, which I'll show you in a second. Now, once again, really, really simple. Vallejo model color black, Vallejo model color violet, Vallejo model color white. Keeping it really, really straightforward with this color scheme. Because first of all, it's purple. Like it's not like silver where you've got to have loads of different colors reflecting in it or anything like that. It's one of the reasons why I didn't do a silver blade, because silver can be one of those colors where you can really, really overcomplicate and put lots of different colors into it. Takes lots of time, and I really didn't want that. A nice shiny silver blade would have worked really well on this avatar, but I would have spent 3 or 4 times the amount of time doing it, and I just didn't want to commit to that. So purple fits with the theme of this model for the Iyanden army, so that's good enough. Now, this part of the blade especially, you can really see that there's a lot of brush marks in this. You can really see these transitions are not particularly amazing. Now, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to show this bottom half of the blade, because this really shows that, first of all, the transitions aren't perfect, but as soon as I put these edge highlights in, fundamentally changes how good those transitions look. The edge highlight actually hides how dodgy the blends are. Now, I appreciate they're not terribly bad blends, but there are still a lot of brush marks in it, and there's still a lot of little dots, and the shape of those highlights are not exactly terrific. But the edge highlight adds a huge amount. It almost disguises it. And this is something that works on everything. If you've got a shape and you've got a blend that maybe you're not too particularly happy with, place your edge highlights in first, because sometimes it will hide how bad that blend looks. It's a really, really interesting trick, and it's something that a lot of people, I say a lot of people do. I know of quite a few display painters who do it when there's just an area where you can't get your brush to it. It's a pain in the backside. You do the blend as good as you possibly can, and then you make sure you put your edge highlights in, and it makes it look 10 times better than it is. I'm always harping on about this. I know people don't like edge highlights. They're incredibly useful, incredibly important, and they're great for hiding things that you don't want people to see. So make sure you use them where it's relevant. Just remember, when you do an edge highlight, you use towards the tip of your brush. So you don't use the point. You use the side of your brush, but towards the tip, because that's the thinnest part of your brush. Right, what I have on my brush right now is Vallejo model color violet with a little bit of black. This paint is not thinned down at all, right? This paint is straight from the pot. And you can see how I'm scrubbing my brush, the side of my brush, over the flat of that panel. The reason for that is because my paint is not thinned down, it doesn't move. I remove the excess paint from my brush, and then as I run it over the flat of that blade, flat of the side of the blade where the runes are, it won't flow. So it won't fall into the pattern. It won't fall into the runes. So it's almost like dry brushing, but you've got more paint on your brush and your paint is wetter. So there's not enough paint for it to flow everywhere or to leave big blobs, but there's enough for it to leave deposits without it flowing around. So think of it as dry brushing. It's really, really useful to do. I'd also recommend doing it with a little bit of a bigger brush, but I was being lazy. I say I was being lazy. I couldn't find my bigger brushes because my desk was a mess at the time. So, but yeah, it's basically a variation of dry brushing where you don't remove as much paint, and it's really, really handy with that sort of stuff. Nice and simple, and the result looks really good. Again, If I was putting this into a competition, I'd probably spend a lot more time on it, but there was just no point. Now, last little hook of the blade, I've got a highlight towards the tip, and then towards like the center part of it here, I've got that big chunk of highlight, which I'm just blending in. So again, really, really straightforward, nice and simple. Dark light, means it's going to pop. The transition is not going to be amazing. I'm stippling it together and I'm glazing it depending on what part I'm doing. The way you blend is up to you again. Remember, watch the glazing video, watch the stippling video. Both of them are really, really useful. But the blend isn't going to be perfect. The minute I put those edge highlights in though, it will look 10 times better than it does right now. Edge highlights are... We need to think of edge highlights a bit like how we think of weathering, right? When we weather tanks and add scratches to armor panels and that sort of stuff, a lot of the time we do it because it looks interesting, but more importantly, it lets us hide areas in the model that we're not particularly happy with, or perhaps our painting is a little bit dodgy. Edge highlights can do exactly the same thing. It can hide how bad your transitions are. You can see that now looks 10 times better than it did a second ago. Really, really powerful, really, really useful. And that's the process for the blade. Black, white, Vallejo model color violet, a little bit of ink, transitions from light, dark, place in your edge highlights, and then that will help your transitions look better than they are. And also, if you put your edge highlights in, it frames it really well, and it makes the blade really readable. It makes it pop. So next up, what we're going to do is work on the blood effects. Now, you can use this. You can take this really far and go really advanced with it. But I've kept it really simple for this because, again, tabletop piece. But this is the foundation for really, really good blood effects. So first of all, you can see that I've got a bit of plastic. This is just like a bit of blister package. Clear plastic will do. This is going to be the frame or the support for the actual dripping blood itself. Now, I'm going to try and keep this into focus as much as possible, but naturally the camera's being a pain in the backside because I'm trying to focus on tiny little bits of plastic. So the first thing that we want to do is cut the blister down into different size shapes, strips, and then we're going to glue that on to the actual model. Now, with this, you can see I'm trying to make lots of different lengths. This is the main thing here because we don't want all of the blood just to hang down, like all the drips to be exactly the same size, because that's going to look really weird. I'd also suggest that you make lots more. I made 3 or 4 times the amount that I was actually going to use, and the reason for that is because it's clear plastic. You're going to lose it on your desk. It will be there and then you'll no longer see it. You're going to drop it, it's going to go flying, or you're going to ping it across the desk. It's an absolute nightmare. So make lots. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use some UV resin. Now, the reason why I'm using UV resin is because it's really, really fast to dry. So this is resin that dries under UV light very quickly. And if you've got a UV torch, it's really, really good, because you can do this all very, very quickly. So you see I've got a pair of tweezers to pick these little bits of blister up. To be honest with you, the tweezers, even with tweezers, it's an absolute nightmare. But what we're going to do, we're going to get these little bits of plastic and we're going to dip them in the UV resin, which you'll see on screen in a second. And then we're going to stick them on with the UV resin. So you can see that little puddle in the corner there. That's the UV resin on just a little bit of card. So make sure that you can see that I've sliced the hanging blood off of the hand. The rest of it up top is going to be covered anyway. So grab your little bits of plastic. You can see I'm going to drop these so many times, but put half of it into the UV resin and then place it onto the model where you want it to go. Now, because the UV resin it's like a gel, it should hold it in place loosely. So it will sit there and then you'll be able to move it quite easily. So you can see how I've placed it on the wrist and then it pushes in towards the hand. So it's not where I want it to go, but that's fine because as you can see, we can push and move it around. And the priority with changing this blood is like, I'm not too bothered about having like crazy, realistic, really, really nice blood. The main thing that I want is the blood to actually fall at the correct angle, because the Games Workshop one, the blood kind of falls sideways and it drives me mad. So the priority with this is purely, I want the blood to fall at the right angle. So you can see I've got an airbrush needle here, an old airbrush needle, and I'm using the airbrush needle to push that bit of plastic to the angle that I want it to be. And I've got that UV torch, and I'm using the UV torch to dry that UV resin at the same time. And that's how I get these drips to fall at the right angle. All right. So it's really, really fiddly, but it is worthwhile. It's also worth noting that if I was doing this on a display piece, a competition piece, I would do it exactly the same way. So again, you can see as soon as I place that on, it falls against the arm. So once again, I get the airbrush needle out and move the piece of plastic into the position that I want it. And then I'm going to get the UV torch out to dry it. Again, really fiddly, but this is the easiest way that I found of doing it. Use tweezers to put it into place. The UV resin, because it's like a gel, will hold it there. Then use something small and thin. In my case, an old airbrush needle. I always save my airbrush needles because they're really handy. Use the airbrush needle to hold it in place, and then use the UV resin torch. Use the UV torch to dry them so they're not going to break. Now, it's worth noting that they're not going to be crazy robust, all right? If you knock them, they're going to break. They're going to come off. If you're too rough with them, they're going to move. Like you can see that one there. I've just caught it and it's moved. So you need to be careful until we get the resin over the top of it, because we're going to cover these in resin so it bulks out. This is not very strong, all right? So be gentle with it at this point and put on as many as you see fit for the task that you're doing, because this will work for everything. You can see I've skipped ahead a little bit. I've got 4 or 5 of these on there now. I've got one of them much longer than the rest, and I've built those up. So this is effectively going to be my frame for that drip in blood. Now, it may not look like it's at the right angle from here, but I assure you it's absolutely spot on. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I need to integrate those bits of plastic into the rest of the blood. So I'm placing, obviously you can see like a big chunk of UV resin. UV resin is going over the whole of those pieces of plastic, because the plastic itself is very thin. It's got sharp edges. It's going to look really weird. So we need to cover the whole of those. But I also want to have a big chunk of UV resin towards the top where they integrate into the actual sculpted blood that Games Workshop has given us. And you can see where the top of it's shiny, that it's got a huge amount of resin there. So first of all, we want to do that because I don't want to see where it changes from the plastic into the sculpted hand, but also because I want a lot of resin there, because that's what's going to hold it in place and make it strong, right? That's what's going to make it so it's durable, because I don't want them to keep breaking. So really, really important. The connection point has to have quite a big, thick chunk of resin, the UV resin. Now what we're going to do, the plastic blister that is hanging down that we've cut, we now need to start bulking them out. So I've got some UV resin on this old paintbrush, and all I'm doing is I'm going to place on UV resin and I'm running it down the length of these blister drips. And what's going to happen is, after I do that, I dry it with a UV resin, and as I keep doing this in layers, those blister drips become more and more covered with UV resin, and they get wider and wider, and they start to look more like drips. Now, what I would say to you, if you were doing this for a competition piece, I would be far more finicky and picky about what these drips look like, as opposed to me. I'm just kind of having them so they kind of just slop down, and that's good enough. But you can use this process, and I'll do this in the future because I've got a model plan for this. You can use this process to get some really nice, thin, super thin, gory drips as well. In this case, again, if I did stuff like that, if I had it really thin, and this is something to think about, if you're using this stuff as a gaming piece, you don't want really thin blood drops, because they're just eventually going to get broken. So, like, bite the bullet. Now, you've got a couple of ways of doing this. The next bit, you can see how these are really bulking out now, and we've got this shape of just kind of almost like a waterfall of blood. So you stop when you're happy with the shape that you have. Now you've got two ways of doing this. The way that I would prefer to do this is Games Workshop's Blood for the Blood God is really, really good. If you mix that in with your UV resin, it will still dry as long as you don't use too much. Or you can go over the top of this with Blood for the Blood God. And it gives a really, really nice result. The problem is I didn't have any and I needed to get this finished. So instead of using Blood for the Blood God, what I did was I used Games Workshop Caribou Crimson Wash, and I put like 5 layers of that over all of this blood. So what happens is it gives it this almost plasticky feel. So it doesn't look particularly great. It looks very misted and rubbish, but it's the right sort of colour. And there'll be another effect. There'll be another part that we put on which will get rid of that anyway, so don't panic too much. But you can see how we've got this really dark blood. I wanted dark blood. What you need to remember is the longer blood has been out, the darker it gets. So bright red blood is very fresh because it's got lots of oxygen in it. If your blood is darker, it means that blood has been out for longer. So for me in this case, what I wanted to do was where the blood was closer up towards the hand, I was going to have that more red, more vibrant. And then as it was dripping down, I was going to have it much, much darker. So what I got here was I got Games Workshop's Evil Sunz Scarlet, which is a really, really bright red. And I painted the whole top half of it in this Evil Sunz Scarlet. So this is giving us that really, really vibrant red. Now, what's really important to note here is this paint is not thinned down. This is straight out of the pot. And then what I do is towards the bottom here, I get a wet brush and I just kind of mess it up. Like I stab it so that vibrant red from the Evil Sunz Scarlet kind of mottles out. And that's it. So it's like a really, really messy wet blend. I'm not too bothered about being neat or anything like that. But now what we have is brighter blood towards, or rather more saturated blood towards the top, darker blood towards the bottom. It just gives it some nice, almost like variation, to be honest with you. As I said, personally, if I had had it, I would have just used Blood for the Blood God and gone over the whole thing. But I didn't, so this is the other way of doing it. Once you've done this, you can see like I'm placing little bits of this red towards the bottom as well. This is just picking out brighter areas to give me some variation. So again, really, really simple here, really, really straightforward. Once you've done that, if it's a little bit too messy, you can do it another wash of Caribou Crimson and it will pull it all together and you won't have to worry about really smooth transitions, which is exactly what I've just done here. So that flows into the recesses. Again, really, really straightforward. And you can see the drips hanging. And more importantly, when you look at this model, the blood flows the right way. Now, this is by no means a masterpiece, but it looks good. And most importantly, it's robust, right? Unless you physically get that blood and crush it with your hands when you're playing, it will not break. So this is a robust way of doing it. Lastly, I'm just going into these drips that Games Workshop has given us with Evil Sunz Scarlet again, and I'm just picking them out. So we've got this variation. This is with a semi-transparent paint, and I'm just putting a little bit of colour in it. Nice and simple. Now, once this is all done, the last step, because we've got a very almost plasticky feel to it, because we've used the Caribou Crimson instead of the Blood for the Blood God, really nice easy fix. Get some gloss varnish and paint it over the top, and it will fix it. It will go shiny. It will lose that plasticky feel. Really, really simple. And this is the point with this model. This is the point with the whole of this Eldar army. I want some really cool results with minimal effort. Really, really durable, really straightforward. Not everything needs to be a masterpiece. I know I keep saying that, but it's really important, you know. And the thing is as well, is if you're always painting for display pieces, it can become quite stressful. Now you can see as soon as I put this gloss varnish on as well, the blood becomes a little bit more vibrant. Nice and easy. And that's the process for it. That really is as simple as it is. UV resin, bits of blister packet, plastic, preferably Blood for the Blood God because it keeps its shiny, glossy finish. But the gloss varnish will recover it. And then lastly, I just went over all the gems with the gloss varnish again, because why not? Gives it that nice shiny feel. Gives it a really good finish. So that's it for the avatar. I'm hoping these videos have been helpful. I know I haven't done a huge amount on them. I don't generally want to be doing too much tabletop stuff on Patreon, but I figure it's good to mix it up and give a little bit of variation. But that's enough for the avatar. I will do some, I've got a video coming up in the future for some like yellow fabric, like high quality yellow fabric. We've got another few projects on the go at the moment as well, so we'll be mixing it up. We've got a Salamander Space Marine for Golden Demon. We're doing a Caradon Overlord's Dwarf for Golden Demon as well. And obviously we're going to have to start thinking about Iron Skull projects as well, which will be non-Games Workshop. So lots of stuff coming. I'm hoping this video series has been helpful. Thank you, everyone, for the support. As always, I really appreciate it. Questions, queries, you know the drill. Let me know. Bye-bye.